Welcome to my American History Notes. This is where I talk about the conclusions that I've drawn from my study of American history. You may not agree with my conclusions, but you should at least know about the topics that I talk about, even if you don't agree, and study them. Try to get some primary sources, read some evidence from journals, diaries, newspaper accounts, laws, and check out when you have somebody that says something like I look at Samuel Eliot Morison or Paul Johnson or one of those. I also look at what they've said, where they got it from, what's their source. Is that a correct interpretation? Do I think can I see it at least? And what about the conclusion? So it's important to study it and take it seriously. Now, I do apologize. My interstitial lung disease is acting up, so I may cough or clear my throat, and I do apologize. I know it's very annoying, I'm told. So there we go. Thank you. Excuse me. All right. So let's start with today's session. Tobacco was king in Maryland as it was in Virginia, and doctor bills were even paid in tobacco in some areas into the 20th century in the more rural counties. Lord Baltimore kept an office in the city of London to handle people who wanted to emigrate to his colony. Many of them were from the servant class. Servants in the colonial era did not mean exactly the same thing as employee in ours, and there was a wide variation in economic background and education as well as skills. In English as well as Dutch colonies, the servant's passage was paid by an employer, and he or she was expected to work for a number of years, 4 or 5 as an adult or more as a minor. Now, we're going to find out later where we get segue into slavery with the addition of the word assign to legal documents, and then also the second thing being where employees then had to start paying for their own way and work for a number of years to work off their transportation costs. That becomes a very important thing of slavery. So we'll talk about that later, though. Upon release from the term of employment, the servant became a free man if they survived, which they often did not due to overwork, poor nutrition, and disease. An indentured servant was someone who had a contract with an employer called an indenture because originally it was torn in two along an irregular edge. The system of exchanging the cost of passage for a period of labor was the principal means of peopling the English colonies and even lasted for many years after they were independent. The people that were forced to eventually pay for their own transportation, it's said by economists who study history that many times in the first year they paid their costs back 7 times by what they produced, and yet they were forced to work for many years, often didn't survive. However, it is commonly understood that many servants were kidnapped, and that includes children, off the streets of England and forced to go to America, which makes them no better off than kidnapped Africans. Even tenant farmers began to be treated in Virginia and Maryland as slaves and were sold and forbidden to leave their employment by law in some cases. The moneyed class eventually would replace servants of European and African ethnicity with purely African slaves, creating a subclass and forcing an alliance with them of the poor person of European descent. The poorest white became a kind of nobility when compared to the black slave, a permanent and hereditary servant slave. Servants in Maryland and other colonies might be of any class, from the poorest gentleman to an ex-con. The average person was young and simply wished for a better life, like my ancestors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Whittison, who didn't come as servants, came from Plumtree, England with a baby and all the possessions they could carry on their backs in 1810, looking for a better life than one they could have had in England. Whereas my first ancestor that I'm aware of on my mother's side came probably as an indentured servant into Virginia back in the 1600s. I think his name was Nicholas Stallings. The transporting of criminals and prisoners of war, begun by James I and continued through Cromwell and the rest of the Stuart kings, usually ending in the West Indies, but some went to Virginia, Maryland, and New England. Early on, a class of criminals existed in London who would engage in trepanning, or kidnapping boys and girls who were placed on a colony-bound ship and sold to masters in Virginia or Maryland. Maryland protested often for being the dumping ground of convicts, but Lord Baltimore found it profitable, so that the practice continued. This kidnapping was systemic, as it was approved of and supported by the established governing authorities in England and America. We will discuss slavery's beginnings in the English colonies in a later class more in depth. Black slaves were slaves until baptized until Maryland's Black Code of 1664, which made a slave for life simply by virtue of his or her color. A law of 1671 declared that neither baptism nor conversion affected a person's slave status. Slavery wasn't extremely important in Maryland until after 1700, but by the time of the Revolution, almost a third of the population was Black and in bondage. We need to also understand, and historically, and I've said this before, serfdom and slavery were not new, but in pre-capitalist societies, lifetime bondage had been the common condition of labor. So this is not a new thing. In fact, as I've said before, the English took how they treated the Irish in Ireland and applied it to the Black slave in America. Very, very interesting study. So we'll stop there and we'll pick it up next time. Thank you for watching.